With Dark Souls 3 coming to an end, I thought now would be a perfect time to look back on the game and try and figure out 10 things that the game actually did right. So, in no particular order, here are 10 things I think Dark Souls 3 did a little bit better than its predecessors. Now, unfortunately, music in video games tends to get overlooked, but it's very hard to ignore the various masterpieces that were composed by Yuka Kitamaru for the Dark Souls 3 soundtrack. It seems as though Dark Souls 3 took heavy inspiration from Bloodborne. With Bloodborne, I feel as though this was their first game in the Soulsborne series that had this huge, epic, orchestral piece, and it seems, like I said, Dark Souls 3 took heavy inspiration from that, and I, for one, am not complaining. Abyss Watchers, Pontiff Sullivan, Dragon Armourer are all notable pieces of music which I hope people remember down the line. Next we have handing in multiple Covenant rewards at the same time. Now this is just a little bit of a gameplay, ease of life move, but I still can't believe it took them this long to put this system in, but it's a welcome change and there's not much else I can talk about it really. I'd rather hand them in all at once than spend 30 minutes handing in each individual humanity one at a time. And then we have weapon arts. Now weapon arts are cool in their own right. I mean, unfortunately they are all a bit samey. All straight swords, all great swords, all ultra great swords seem to have the same weapon art, but again, this opens up a plethora, I need to get that word right, of options that can then be implemented into new weapons. Not every weapon can have these amazing visual eye candy weapon arts, but the ones that I do, such as Frida's Scythe or Valorheart or Profane Greatsword, all look super badass. I just wish they could diversify them a little bit more than they did, but it's a good step in the right direction. Now I remember back when playing Dark Souls 2, I spec'd into Faith, and I loved nothing more than running around with a full Faith build and only having one use of my spell. Now fortunately in Dark Souls 3 they brought back the FP bar, and this was a welcome change because I do primarily play Faith builds, so it was nice having this FP bar that I could use rather than the spell usage item over and over again in Dark Souls 2, but I do think bringing the FP bar back from Demon Souls was a very good move on their part. Unfortunately, it doesn't make magic or faith builds viable because the spells kind of suck, but that's going to be in another video. Now the combat in Dark Souls 3 I feel hits the perfect balance between Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2. In Dark Souls 1 we had this super clunky feeling, for me personally anyway, and then for Dark Souls 2 we had a similar vibe, but everything was a little bit more floaty, things tend to flow a little bit better. But in Dark Souls 3 I feel as though we hit that perfect sweet spot in combat. We have this sense of weight, yet we don't feel like a giant submarine, unless we're obviously wearing submarine-like armor. The only thing I would feel would need changing is the stamina cost for rolling. It's kind of small. If you change the stamina cost of rolling, a lot of things would be affected by it. That's the only downside to the combat I feel for me personally, is rolling is far too cheap. But with that aside, I do feel as though the combat is more satisfying in Dark Souls 3 than Dark Souls 1 and 2 combined. But for me, the crown of combat in Soulsborne will always belong to Bloodborne. I just love that freaking combat so much. When a game can make you feel satisfied by dodging a move, that's when you know they've got the combat right. Dodging in Bloodborne just feels so good, and unfortunately you don't really get that feeling in Dark Souls. But anyway, that aside, combat in Dark Souls 3, I feel as though it's the best yet for the Dark Souls games. Now I feel as though a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this one, but Dark Souls 3 I feel is more accessible to newer players, which I think is a good thing. I think more people playing Dark Souls the better in my eyes, but you're always going to have the elitists say that, oh, the fact that it's more accessible to newer players, it's more pandering to the casual audience. I mean, yes, that's true, but again, my first initial point is the more people playing Dark Souls, the better. And I kind of want to get out of this elitist stigma, because I was one of those elitist people back when Dark Souls 3 came out. I was like, okay, this is really easy. But then I kind of took a minute to think about it, and I said to myself, well, difficulty is very subjective and it differs from person to person. So if Dark Souls 3 is pandering to a more casual audience and that opens up the floodgates for more people to maybe just give Dark Souls a try, that's great, because then they might feel as though they want to try the other games. And that's just fantastic. Like I said, the more people playing Dark Souls, it'll be better. Because Dark Souls is quite an intimidating game to get into. It's known for being a very difficult game, and some people just don't want to go through that, and you kind of have to respect that. And this is coming from a Dark Souls, oh god, I fucking hate this word, a Dark Souls veteran. If the game is more easier, that means more players can play it, and I am perfectly happy with that. Now, one of my biggest criticisms of Dark Souls 2 was its lacking in visual detail in the environments, and just the environments you were exploring just didn't really look very nice, even though they weren't supposed to look very nice. But you know what I mean, it was just bland, repeated textures on the ground and on the walls. It just looks ugly. Now, fortunately, in Dark Souls 3, they kind of alleviated that problem. The areas feel bustling, alive, there's intricate detail on the ground and on the walls. And yes, I know when the game launched, and I think there's still a couple to this day, there's missing textures. I think in Archdragon Peak there's still the missing rock texture, but I don't know why they haven't fixed that. But no, in Dark Souls 3, it seems as though they took a leaf out of Bloodborne's book, and Bloodborne is very generous with how much detail they cram into the world, and that's always a good thing. I'm always a sucker for an environment that looks gorgeous. So yeah, compared to Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3's aesthetic changes were a massive welcomed addition for me. And plus it looks beautiful as well, look at this! Ooh! Ah! Oh, that's good! Oh, would you look at that? Next we have password matchmaking. Now this is a system straight from Bloodborne. They used a similar system back in Dark Souls 2, but unfortunately that system kinda sucked. With the password matchmaking, it's a lot easier for you to group up with friends and partake in some jolly cooperation or organise fight clubs and stuff amongst your friends. Admittedly, you do need friends to do this, which is always a struggle, but the password matchmaking system is a good thing, and I hope we see a lot of that. Maybe refine it a little bit more in the later games, because right now, even though you can scale up or down, there's still some issues with that, which I'm not intelligent enough to know what that entails. But yeah, anyway, the password matchmaking system is a nice addition. Again, coming straight from Bloodborne, I feel as though it works better with the signs in Dark Souls rather than the bells used in that game. But yeah, that's a good addition, I like it. And then next we have no armor upgrading and easier to upgrade weapons. Now, I can see both arguments for and against this topic, but for me, I like changing in and out of armors, and it always pissed me off, especially in the first two games, where if I hadn't upgraded the armor, I would be at a significant disadvantage. Well, not significant, but you know what I mean. So having the option to try on everything and not feel as though I am putting myself at a disadvantage is a nice feeling, and that's good, I like that. Also, regarding the weapons, in Dark Souls 1, still to this day, I am so overwhelmed with the amount of crafting materials needed for what infusion and what goes where. So in Dark Souls 3, again, this goes back to another point we made, is more accessible to newer players. It's a lot easier to upgrade various weapons. There's only 3 types of weapon upgrades, Titanite, Twinkling Titanite, and the Dragon Scales. Is it Dragon Scales? Which I feel as though is a very good thing. I think the infusions should be added to boss weapons, just like in Dark Souls 2. That was a shame. But other than that, I really do like the refinement of the upgrading system. It just makes things so much easier and less of a hassle. The DLC, Ashes of Ariandel, was short, disappointing, and left a sour taste in my mouth. The Ringed City, on the other hand, was in short, to me, the best piece of content Dark Souls has had to offer since the original DLC, Artorias of the Abyss. You can see my initial thoughts on it on my Buyer Beware video, but in short, the level design didn't feel familiar, which was fantastic. It didn't feel like we were being shooed down this linear path. Shortcuts leading us back to previous areas just felt fantastic. The new weapons, the new armor, all were awesome. Was it a good send-off for the entire Dark Souls franchise? Well, that's up to you, but that's a hell of a job to live up to. it couldn't possibly live up to everyone's hype, but I feel as though it did a pretty good job, and compared to the other DLCs in the Souls franchise, yes, I actually feel Dark Souls 2 DLCs was probably better than the base game, and I know to some of you that really isn't hard. But the Ring City, I feel, blew everything out of the park, so that's why it earns a spot on this list. And that's going to be it for this video. As always, you guys can follow me on Twitter to stay up to date with what I'm doing. Take care everyone, be good to one another, and I'll see you next time.